I believe that blood sugar is one of the biggest drivers of complications in pregnancy. This is a really important issue and it matters early, like before you even think about pregnancy, before you conceive. Blood sugar instabilities, or basically eating too much sugar during pregnancy, can cause something called macrosomia, which is a fancy way of saying that the baby's birth weight is way higher than it naturally otherwise would have been. Not only that, but there's an increased risk of gestational diabetes in the mom. The problem with both of these issues is they lead to an increased chance of medical interventions as well as higher C-section rates. And not only that, the relationship that we have with sugar and our blood sugar health affects the metabolic health of our future child. So there's a possibility here that you're either building metabolic health for your child down the road or you're building metabolic illness. And that is kind of a harsh reality, but I think it's an important one. So, what's causing this? What's causing these insulin disruptions that are creating complications in pregnancy and birth? Basically, what we're dealing with culturally is this increased normalization of high carb, high sugar, low protein diets. I think in general, we're constantly snacking. We're almost on autopilot when it comes to consuming a lot of certain types of food products. And there's just really not a lot of blood sugar awareness or literacy around this, but especially not in pre pregnancy, like, especially not in fertility and in our reproductive era. I also think a lot of us don't really get a lot of practice in managing certain lifestyle decisions, right? A lot of women are working. A lot of women might not know how to cook. That might need to be like a skill set someone has to learn in order to kind of shift away from eating like high processed or high sugar types of diets. I also just think it's really common for people to not have a lot of practice in things like going without sugar for an extended amount of time, or going without things that taste sweet for a certain amount of time. And even just the art of practicing something like managing food cravings is kind of a skill set, and it does take some practice. And the argument that I have with this is that by the time you get to pregnancy and you have all these crazy cravings, it's important that you have some of these skill sets set in place so that you're not just being overrun with food cravings and you're feeling like you're out of control in the food choices that you might be making. So, just to kind of connect the dots here, right? We have unstable blood sugar, which means we have excess glucose in the blood, which is directly affecting the baby and causing a larger size baby, or a baby that is otherwise bigger than it would be if it didn't have that high glucose impact. And then your body starts to take the brunt of that and develops gestational diabetes. Obviously, I'm not speaking from a place of certainty. It's not like you eat a candy bar and then you're guaranteed to get gestational diabetes. I'm not saying that. It's just that's how these that's just like an example of how that cascade could go. And really, the only problem that we have with things like macrosomia and gestational diabetes is that they sort of increase unfavorable outcomes for a lot of women. A lot of women don't go into the pregnancy and the birth experience being like, yes, I want complications. Yes, I want to become a high risk person. Yes, I want that emergency C section. Like, no, that's not what a lot of women want. And obviously, if you have other reasons for wanting to pursue, say, like a cesarean on your own terms, that's a totally different story. But a lot of women want to avoid sort of those emergency type situations or those high risk environments. Okay, so how do we address this in a practical sense? I think the first step would be to prioritize animal protein and healthy animal fats at every meal. Another good thing is to try to avoid starting the day with carbs or sugar. I think breakfast is an incredibly important meal of the day personally, and I think it should largely be comprised of protein and fat. Another good habit is to not eat carbs by themselves. Always try to pair carbs with fat or protein. Another good way to manage glucose is to take a walk after each meal, if possible. And then the most obvious way is to reduce ultra processed snacking, excess sugar consumption, stuff like that. And of course, the more obvious way to avoid all this is to just reduce sugar overall, reduce ultra processed foods and snacking, staying away from things like cakes, cookies, crackers, stuff like that. There are a lot of unknowns and a lot of twists and turns that kind of impact all of us along the way when it comes to pregnancy, birth, and the entire reproductive journey, right? But there are so many factors that are absolutely preventable. And I think a lot of the problems and complications that come up as a result of high glucose or insulin resistance or blood sugar instabilities are oftentimes very preventable. Again, this is not about shame or trying to make anyone feel bad. This is simply about informed consent. Culturally and medically, this information really isn't that available, and it's definitely not as accessible to women as it should be, and that's why I'm here. I break all of this down in my free guide, the Preconception Risk Reduction Blueprint, which you can find down in the description below. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.